Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. This is Understanding React.js at San Francisco Drupal User Group on July 2021. The slide deck, the code examples, and even a recording of a previous version of this presentation is available online. And all of those resources, you just can follow that link and you will get everything already. So I would suggest that instead of like trying to take notes specifically, like put attention and you know, know that everything you can just like have readily available right after the presentation is complete. And I would appreciate if at the end, there are questions to clarify anything that I might not explain, fully. My name is Mauricio Dinarte. I go by Dinarcon online, Drupal.org, Twitter, and that's mostly where I'm active, and also Slack in the Drupal community channel. My email and my Drupal.org profile. I am from Nicaragua, beautiful country, known as the land of lakes and volcanoes. And we do have like literally tens of volcanoes, and at some point, 5 of them were active. So we really mean it. We also have, freshwater lakes, in which you find islands, in which you find more volcanoes, in which you find hot springs, and it is like water, land, recursively forever, basically. I collaborate with Agaric, distributed cooperative. It is based in Boston, but we have people all over the world. Myself, I am based in Nicaragua. We have people in Germany and throughout the States in a couple of cities. This is one of those active volcanoes that I mentioned before. You can go to that website, or if you are, curious enough, you can come to Nicaragua, walk up to the crater, look down, and that's what you're going to see there. Let's dive right in. Why we want to use React. So React has this philosophy of learning once and apply it everywhere. And the idea behind this is that there is a core framework that you can learn, which is based in JavaScript, and there is a separate layer on top of that core framework that is called renderers. So you can target specific platforms. For example, if you're building a website, there is a renderer for the web. If you want to build a mobile application, there is a renderer for mobile devices. If you are working with VR, if you are working with desktop applications. So you have this base framework that once you learn, you can have a common code base that serves as your base configuration, and on top of that, build specific features for each of these frameworks. There are literally like about 35 renderers, and you can find a list of them in that URL. In my case, I mostly work on the web, but as I said before, you can find examples online. For example, when you have a monorepo that will provide both a web and a mobile application, and that is going to be sharing a lot of the code base. So, this is one of the things that people get drawn to, because you get to, reuse the knowledge and target different applications. Another benefit of React is that it allows for an incremental implementation. I know that we are in the context of a Drupal meetup, so I will try to use an analogy here. Let's say that we have a Drupal website and we want to decouple it. We can take incremental steps. For example, if we have the search feature of the website, instead of changing everything at once, we only want to change the search feature. So maybe we have a blog on the website, and that blog is going to be powered by React. Let's say that that blog went well, and you now want to replace the whole features around searching, like facets, the search results, the search page, all of that. So maybe you go to the next level, like you start changing the main content only for certain pages of the site. And let's say that things are going well and you want to go fully decouple, then you can implement a fully working website using React, and just use Drupal as your backend, like your content repository. So you are not forced to to do it all or nothing, or to do it all at once. For example, there is a project that I've been working on for some time, and in that project, the only thing that was powered by React was the checkout process, and that has been the case for a couple of years. And we are in the process at the moment of switching that. We're going to use Drupal just as the backend, and we're going to build a React application for the front end. And it's going to be completely decoupled in a couple of months. But between that initial implementation of just the checkout process and this new phase, it has been a couple of years already. So you can use the technology at your own pace without being forced to take all or nothing decisions at any point. Another benefit of React is it has a great developer experience. For one, it is a relatively small API surface. You can literally read the whole documentation, like official documentation for React in one afternoon. And I highly recommend that because even if you don't need all the features, or even if you don't understand all the features benefits right at once, you at least have an idea of what is available and what tools you can reach out when necessary. Um, Another benefit of React, contrary to some other JavaScript frameworks, is that you use JavaScript constructs. And by that, what I mean, it is basically JavaScript. You are writing JavaScript. There is no custom templating engine. There is no extra features added to the language that is beyond the JavaScript specification for the most part. There is a couple of caveats that I'm going to show during the demo, but for the most part, you're going to be writing plain JavaScript. Another benefit is that there are great error reportings and developer tools. As we're going to see during the demo, sometimes you even get like exactly the change that you need to do to fix the problem right in the development console. And if not, you get redirected to, you get links to pages in the official documentation that talk about the problem and how you can potentially solve it. Um, Another benefit, and we're going to see this today, it is easy to get started. I remember, over a decade ago when I started with Drupal, for example, I needed to set up a LAMP stack, like, oh, how do I install a web server? How do I install a database? How do I install PHP so I can start working with Drupal? Something similar can be said about JavaScript and Node.js application in general. Back, in the day, you had to get a lot of prerequisites before starting writing the code, for your application. Nowadays, if you just want to explore how to work with React, there are tools like Unpackage, like Code Sandbox, and there are many, many more that allow you to just like in your browser without having to install anything locally, start writing like fully working JavaScript applications. And there have been examples where people like write full application in these tools and they just deploy them to the final version without ever having to install things locally, because they are actually very powerful. And something that it's particularly interesting to me is that React has the concept of code mods, and this is not something novel to the React environment, but it is something very useful. And what code mods are is command line tools that allow you to automate the update of your code to newer versions. We know that again in the context of a Drupal meetup, we are transitioning from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 to Drupal 9 to Drupal 10. And along the way, we are changing the code, we are deprecating some functions, and adhering to new best practices and so on. And as you might be aware, there are some tools like Rector, PHP Stan, and others that allow you to automatically detect and in some cases change the code so that you adhere to the new best practices and standards. So that basic idea is applies also in React, and those are called call modes. I remember that this website that I mentioned before about the checkout process using React, we use this tool to update from backbone-based application to convert to native ES6 syntax, like newer JavaScript syntax, and in between, like, that was a few years ago, there have been new releases of React, with new best practices and stuff. So again, like, the code mods allow us to go from that old syntax, if you will, to the new syntax. So I invite you to have a look. There are a lot of automated tools that will help you with that. And just as a context, one reason for this is because React is used by a lot of big companies that have big properties written in React. And you know, they it is in their best interest that there are these tools to automate the process instead of having to manually update every line of code possible. So it's very powerful. With that, I have a couple of more slides that I will very likely switch back to the end, but I like this to be more like a practical exercise. So I'm just going to switch to the live demo. And this being a live demo, of course, nothing will go wrong. So let's see. Hopefully, you can see my screen, and that the size is fine for everyone. If not, let me know and I can make it bigger or smaller as needed. As I said before, everything that I'm going to show is already available in my GitHub profile, github.com/dinarcon, and you can scroll down. Use one of the pin repositories. It's called React.js Basics. This was actually created um, as a workshop. So if you explore the code repository, like what you get as the base is like the final version of the application, but there are like step-by-step instructions. Like, you can actually follow this on your own, and in each of these steps you are going to have comments guiding you as to what you need to do next, and the next step is going to provide the solution for the previous one. So again, this was built in the context of a workshop, and we will be going through some of these steps one by one, and then at the end I'm just going to give an overview of the end result so you can get a sense of the whole application. uh, Something else to note, as I mentioned, over time, new version of React come about. They provide newer syntax or newer features. So there are actually two branches in this repository. Main is using something that is called React hooks, which is kind of like the new thing around. Before that, there are React components were written using JavaScript classes. So there is also another branch that explains basically all of the same example, but using the previous syntax. So if you happen to be, if you happen to be in a project that uses the old syntax and you want to compare how it would look like in the new one, this can also be used as a reference. Um, that being said, I'm going to show the application. This is basically very simple voting application that you can select your favorite JavaScript framework, and the application itself is going to order itself based on the number of votes that each of them get. Uh, this is intentionally simple because I want to focus on the like JavaScript specific and React specific concepts instead of like worrying about styling or a lot of markup. So that this is what we're going to do. Um, and as I alluded in the description of the presentation, what we're going to do is actually take a plain HTML website, like a static website, and convert that into a React application. So what we see on my left is my IDE. A couple of things to mention about the IDE is that I am using a plugin called Live Server that allows me, to save the file and automatically reload the page. So if I, for example, make a change here and I save my file, you can see that it automatically reloaded my JavaScript, my browser window, and included that change. So that's a live server for VS Code. And I am also using a plugin called Prettier that we're going to see in action in a moment when I start actually going over the example, but it is going to format my JavaScript automatically for me. So those are, two plugins that I'm using that are, kind of relevant to the experience that we're going to present in a moment. As for the repository, this is basically just a clone of what we saw in GitHub with two added files, init, index init, and script init. This is basically a copy of the first step exercise, and from there we're going to, be covering many of the steps together. And with that being said, let's get started. So each of the steps, as I mentioned before, they are going to contain comments as to what you need to do. In our case, for this first part, our goal is to replace one line of the static website with React. Remember that I mentioned that you can go, progressively. You can make small changes, and then you can change the whole page if you want. So in this case, we're just going to change one line, and that line is going to be the subheading, but for your favorite one. Instead of being hard coded in HTML, we're going to render this as a React application. In order to achieve this, we're going to actually need three different uh, changes, both in my HTML file and my JavaScript file. So what are those changes? In HTML, I need to import the JavaScript uh, that is going to be responsible for loading the React framework. And because I am building an application for the web, remember that we have this platform specific library too. In this case, it's called React DOM. So I actually need to include two JavaScript libraries, like the base React framework and then the React DOM renderer, which is used to target a specific, the web framework. I'm going to remove these comments. And as the comment said, you can use some package to load the JavaScript. For simplicity, what I'm going to do is I have in the repository the packages already available. So I'm just going to include them locally. The reason for this is that sometimes I present this workshop offline, like in real life in-person events. And if we don't have a connection for some reason, at least this allows us to continue working. But ideally, you can just get the links from one package, and those will also work. So in this case, I'm going to create a script tag where the source is pulling from the packages, and I will be getting the React library itself. And we basically need to copy this and now get the React DOM library. So these are the development versions for both of them, React and React DOM. That is step one. The second thing that we need to do is decide where we want to mount our JavaScript or React application. In this case, I said that I want to replace this with React. So basically, what you do is you create um, any HTML element. Normally, this is going to be a div. Uh, you need to be able to identify it somehow. In my case, I'm going to say React app as my ID for the div. And that's it. This, like when we write our code in JavaScript, what we're going to do is instruct React to look for this div with the specific ID and replace it with the content of our application. So step two is just like remove the hard-coded part and replace it by a mounting point, which can be, a simple div with an ID. It can be any other HTML element with a class or some way to identify. The last part that we need to do is instruct the application to load or a specific JavaScript file that is going to be hosting our application. So this is another script import, and the file that we're going to load is the one that I have here, script underscore init. So those are all the changes that we need, and I just save the file, and by saving the file, you can see that my subheading is gone. Why? Because I don't have any code in my JavaScript file still. So what do we do on the JavaScript end? Again, we need 3 steps, like 3 changes. The first one is to use uh, a function called create element, and we're going to see what the end result of this is going to be. In my case, I'm going to create a constant, label it element, and then by calling this function, it expects 3 parameters. The first one is what HTML tag you want to create. You might remember from before that what I had there was a p tag. Then the second element, I'm going to specify null for now, and we're going to come back to this in a moment. And the third parameter is what is going to be the HTML content of the p tag in this case. So vote for your favorite one, and then I just save. Nothing happens because just like by creating the constants, it doesn't do anything. In this case, I need to get a reference to the DOM container where I'm going to mount my JavaScript application, my React application. So what I want to do this time is, again, use another JavaScript function, document get element by ID. You can use any function that you have at your disposal to get reference to DOM elements. So in this case, DOM container. And the ID that I specified before was React-app. And the final part is use the React DOM library. This is the one that is the renderer specific for the web. And what do you want to render? I want to render my React element, which is this p tag. And where do you want to render it? In the DOM container. And if I save, now I do get my results. How can I verify that this is actually coming from React and not from somewhere else? I'm going to open the DevTools, and if I inspect here, if I inspect, I can see that this is indeed my div with ID of React, and inside that div, it's the React application as I define it. I have a p tag with some text, whatever text that I define. Now, you might notice that this is a little bit different from what we had before. For one, it is not all uppercase letters. And also, I had some bold text inside of this string. So let's try to get that. Something to note about the create element function of React is that, at least it is expecting 3 parameters, but you can pass as many as you want. So I can actually break this, for example, like this, like one string, another string, another string. And after clicking save, this is where prettier comes into place, like because it determined that the line was too long, it just put like line breaks in between the parameters for the function. But basically, if you pass more than 3 parameters, what React is going to do is just like concatenate the result of them together. And this is basically, the same that I got before, the same result. But why do I do it like this? Because React elements can be nested inside of each other. So if I want to put this in bold, for example, as it was the case before, what happened is that I had a strong tag for this part of the text. So I can basically call this function again and say strong, again null for now, and click save. Oh, yeah, it took a while to reload the page, but now you can see that I have my text there, and I can verify by inspecting the code, and I do have p, some text, a strong tag, and 1. You might start thinking already that this is a little bit crazy, like having to write HTML pages like this. This is going to become unmanageable very soon, but bear with me just a little longer. There is one thing that I want to talk about the create element function, and that is about the second parameter. So the second parameter is actually an object that contains different React specific properties that indicate how to render the p tag in this case. So one of those properties is called class name, and this is used to like add classes to the tag itself. In my case, I'm going to add a class called subheading, and if I refresh, uh, under the hood, this is applying the class, and in my CSS, which is very, very, very light, I'm just making anything that has the subheading class uppercase. So this is like the equivalent of what I had before. And as I said before, you can build a whole page, like a whole nested tree of elements just by following this approach, but it would be very, very hard to maintain, like having one function inside one function and so on. So because of this, the React team created an extension, if you will, called JSX that tries to mimic uh, uh, like HTML syntax. So it is easier to write code. So let's have a look at how this looks like. I'm going to replace all of this by JSX. Um, 1 second here. So this is more in line with what we might be used to writing HTML by hand. The only difference is that in HTML you would use class to specify classes. In React you are going to use class name, and there are about 4 properties that are different between HTML and CSS. One of them is class, another one is for, and there are other 2 that are a little bit special, but for the most part your JSX is going to look very similar to regular HTML. And we're going to see some of the benefits of that as we continue transitioning this application, like the whole page, to use React. So what I'm going to do here, because I'm using JSX, I no longer need to call React create element. That is going to be done automatically for us. And I just need to specify the JSX syntax that I want to use. So in this case, I'm going to save. We can see that Prettier automatically formatted my text, but there is something weird, like the text disappeared. Why? If I open the DevTools, you can see that you have a syntax error in your JavaScript file. It says that in line 2, there is an unrecognized angle bracket there. Why? Well, why is this happening? Because this JSX syntax is not valid JavaScript. Like you are not allowed in JavaScript to have this angle bracket. So when the JavaScript parser tries to see this, it says, I don't know how to deal with that. Now, the reason why the whole page didn't crumble, like you didn't get a white screen of the death, if you will, is because HTML itself is pretty resilient. And if it doesn't understand something, it just like bypasses that and tries to continue rendering the page with whatever information that you can provide. So basically, if I switch back temporarily to the HTML file, this is the only line that when running JavaScript, it didn't make sense what to do with it, like with the inside of this content, but the rest of the HTML is still valid. So you see the results of that. But how can we fix this problem? Like we definitely want to use JSX because it's going to make writing the application a lot easier. And the solution is to use a library that is able to transform this like extension, this new syntax, to something that the browser can understand. And in order to do this, we need to make 2 changes. The first one is load that library into the application. In this case, I'm going to use a library called Babel. This is one of many that you can use, but it's not the only one. I just added a library, click save, and it is still not showing. Why? I need to make another change in my HTML, and that is in when I import the React application, I need to tell the browser that this is going to be some Babel code that needs to be transpiled. like that need to be converted to a syntax that the browser can understand. And now by making this, adding this attribute type equals text bubble, you can see that I am getting back my one line of code that I had before. If we look at the console, we see that we get a warning. It says that we are using an in-browser Babel transformer and that this is not recommended in production, and that is totally fair, that is totally valid. You are not supposed to be making this transformation of the syntax in the browser because that's going to slow down the experience for your visitors. Normally, what you do is you have a build process, it's called, that as part of that build process, you pass your application with not only JSX, but with any newer JavaScript features that might not be available cross browsers. And then you run a transpiler, something like Babel, that is going to convert that to uh, a JavaScript version that most browsers can understand. And it is possible to configure these tools to target a specific like browsers or specific browser versions, depending on what you need to support. So, that's a separate discussion. For now, even though it is not recommended, for the purpose of this example, we're going to continue with the in-browser transformation, but you can follow this link, or if you choose to use something other than Babel, like verify how to do that as a build step instead of doing that, in the browser for your visitors. Okay, so let's say that things are going well and we decide that instead of just changing one line, I want to change the whole header of my applications to use JavaScript. I mean to use React. So what I'm going to do is go back to my HTML, and I am going to copy, literally copy the header, and I'm going to add it here. I'm going to close my header tag here. I'm going to remove this, remove this, save, and save my JavaScript file. And that's it. Like if I decide to continue making the transformation, it is as simple as copy the HTML from your static website into the element that you want to render. Make sure that changes like class name are made if necessary, but for the most part, it was just like literally copying and pasting, and I get the same result. I'm not going to do this, all the time, just in the interest of time. But one last time, I want to show that now the ID is rendering not only that one line of the subheading, but the header tag, the H1, the P, all of that. So now we are sure that all of this is being rendered by React. So let's continue with this process. One of the high selling points of React is being able to reuse um, elements, and in particular, this has a name, components. They are called in React. So a component is like HTML markup that you want to render, but you can also embed logic in that HTML markup. For the sake of this example, we're going to transform this React element into a React component. And along the way, we're going to talk a few things about, components and how they work. So how do I convert this to a component is I need to define a function. And the convention is to start the function name with a capital letter. That is not strictly a requirement, but that is often the case. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. In addition to that, this being a function, the HTML that is going to be returned, um, we need to wrap it in the return statement, and that is basically it. So we change from a regular element to a component. Again, by convention, it started with a capital letter. You can see now that my whole header is lost. Why? Because I'm trying to render an element, like a variable that doesn't exist. So how do I render a component instead? You render it like if it were HTML. You put the name of the component in angle brackets, and then you can close them like a self-closing tag. And if I click save, now everything is back. Uh, One of the reasons why this is a convention is because one of the checks that React does to identify what components are like core HTML tags and what components are custom made by the user is by checking the capital letter at the beginning. As I said, there are, this is not a strict requirement. There are other ways in which you can specify components, but for the most part, this is a good convention to follow. And let's say that, this is great. Now we have a React component. We know that we need to define a function with a capital letter. We need to return some JSX from that function that is going to be rendered to the page when that specific component is being called. Let's say that we want to continue and we want to create another component, in this case to render the candidates, the possible candidates. In this case, I'm going to, create another function. The component is going to be called candidate list, and I'm going to return something. So this is kind of the skeleton of a component, a function with a capital letter at the beginning for the name, and return some HTML. So what I'm going to return here, I am going to return all of this, the H2, the section, all of that. So I'm going to save this. And you can see that I just saved and I lost some context because of course it was deleted. But now I am basically rendering the whole application, or that's what I'm going to do, render the whole application using React. And the only thing that my HTML became was like a shell, importing the libraries that I'm going to use, have a mounting point for the React application, and then importing the React application itself. So this is like stripped down to a very basic HTML document. And in my JavaScript, I'm going to literally paste this. And if I try to save this, and then I try to render it, you see that I get a blank screen. In this case, I'm going to open the DevTools to have a look at what's going on. And in my console, I get an error saying that adjacent JSX element must be wrapped in an enclosed tag. So this is a restriction in React that an element can only return one child element. That child element can have a necessary structure as much as we want. If we compare this to the previous one, we can see that we have one root header element, and inside of that, we have an H1 and we have a P tag. But in this case, we're trying to return an H2 along, like at the same level as a section. So this is not allowed. There are many ways to work around this. One of them is adding a div, for example, like at the beginning, one at the end, and that gets rid of the problem. You can see that now my candidates list component, which I updated the render down below, is being rendered. But there is a problem. It is not recommended to add HTML wrappers just for the sake of complying with a React requirement. Like this is not semantic HTML, and we should strive for semantic HTML as much as possible. So in order to work around this in a like cleaner manner, that the React dev team came up with a new component called a React fragment. So instead of having an empty div, you call a React fragment at the beginning and one at the end with the with the closing tag there. And if I click save, this continues to work without having to render any extra markup. This React fragment, when rendered to the page, it doesn't create a new tag. This is just like a wrapper for React itself. Now, something about fragments is that they have an alternative syntax, and that syntax is do not use like the word React fragment at all. Just have an opening and closing tag at the beginning and an opening and closing tag at the end. And if I save, this should still render. But while this is valid, I recommend that you not follow this approach because it might be confusing. If people are not familiar with this syntax, they might think that you forgot to add the tag that you wanted to render, and they might, oh, maybe they wanted to do a div or an article or something else. Like I think that writing code, ideally the target should be humans, not computers. And if you make it easier for humans to understand and to wrap their hair around that without having to think much about all the shortcuts that people might take, that is better. And probably that human will be yourself in a couple of months. So try to write legible code, and not one that is just clever. At least that's my recommendation. So with that being said, we have another problem that we can see in the console. We see an invalid DOM property. Uh, it says class, and did you mean class name? Oh yes, of course. Remember that we just literally copy and pasted the HTML from the static side to the React application, but we forgot to update the properties. So in this case, I'm going to change class name to, excuse me, class to class name in all of the instances, and that error is gone. And this is now valid HTML, excuse me, valid React code without that warning there. Um, Continuing a little bit with the transformation, we're going to do one more change to get the result that we had. This I'm just going to paste from basically the final version. What I'm going to do is create yet another React element, in this case called rating app. I'm going to wrap two other elements in a fragment. Remember that if we want to refer to them, we call them like if they were HTML tags with angle brackets at the beginning and the self-closing tags. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to render the header element. I'm going to render the candidate list element, and this rating app, this is what ultimately I want to render, like the whole thing. I'm going to click save here. And now I have an application that is fully rendered by React. But still there is not a lot of benefit. Um, One of the things that React is famous for is being able to reuse information, components, and so on. And at this point, I can see that I have a lot of repetition here. Like I have, like for each of the articles, I am creating tags manually. So what we're going to do now is create a new React element that is going to encapsulate some of this information so that we can reuse it over and over. This will probably be the last part of the demo. Then we switch to the slides and open it for Q&A. But what I'm going to show is actually one of the selling points, if you will, for React. And again, I'm just going to, for the sake of time, copy this from a version of the application that is almost completed. And in this case, what I'm saying is the the component is going to be called candidate. I am going to return something, and that something is basically this HTML that I had here. So for one, I can now render this component, and I'm going to get the same result. Another thing that I can do is that I can render that component multiple times, and I get React 3 times. But the whole point of creating a separate component to encapsulate this behavior is actually to be able to uh, pass information dynamically, so that each time that the component is rendered, it presents something different. So how do I pass information to a component? This is a two-step process. For one, I need to um, pass what you pass is called properties, and they work like if they were JavaScript HTML attributes. So for example, I can say name equals React. I can say year, sorry, year equals 2013. and I can say that the image is, whatever I had before, this path. So whatever you pass as properties, these are called properties, you are going to receive in your function as a parameter called props. This, you can name this whatever you want, but they are normally called props. And now, how do you actually get access to them? You use a JavaScript React syntax that is opening and closing brackets. You say props, and then what do you want to read from props? Oh, I want to read the name. So props name. What do you want to read this time? I want to read the props.year. I want to read in the source. I'm going to copy this. I want to read the image. And you can see that the alt text, it's kind of hard coded there. So we can actually use a feature in JavaScript called template literals. So I'm going to replace this by a template literal. Again, this is a JavaScript feature. Uh, Basically, anything that you put in these brackets is going to be JavaScript that is going to be interpreted and printed to the page. So in this case, I am accessing a property on the props object. In this case, I am using a template literal to create some dynamic value. But the whole point of that is that I am able to pass a dynamic information to the component, and based on those elements that are received, you can, render elements as with, that have a similar structure but different data under the hood. So I'm going to refresh. You can see that the first time it worked, then we get some weird stuff because why? These elements, I am not passing anything here. We're going to see in a moment how we can try to prevent this type of errors, but for now, I'm just like literally going to copy this to render those elements dynamically. In the case of Vue, it was released in 2014, and the path to the file is different. In the case of Angular, it was released in 2010, and again the path is different. And if I save, now I can see my React, Vue, and Angular. These are components that are being rendered dynamically with some specific properties, and I have some extra data because I still have hard-coded information. I'm just going to delete all of this. I'm going to save, and now this is a component that I am passing properties, and then I am bringing those properties to have a similar consistent structure, but with different data all the time. The last thing that I want to point out is that there is some validation that you can add to your React application in the form of prop types. The way that prop types work is that you can call the name of the component dot prop types, and you can say what properties you're expecting. In this case, I am expecting a property called name, property called year, and in this example, a property called image. What they are strings, and they need to be required. If they are missing, you are going to get an error. So if I save this, and for example, I try to, uh, let me check. It looks like I have, oh, let me, let me see what's going on. Oh, good point. You can see that the whole thing just broke, and I am not, now if I open the console, I say that prop type is not defined, and that is because prop type itself is another library, so I need to import that library, and that I have in packages, prop types. And the reason why this used to be part of the core library, but it was extracted. And the reason for this is because this is not the only ways. And in fact, there are other ways like TypeScript that provide better, like a more robust framework about checking for required properties and stuff. So again, TypeScript is a whole topic on its own. But in this case, if I start removing elements to a point that something that is required is missing, you start seeing that these warnings like, oh, this component was expecting a property called name and it didn't have it. The other component had a property called year and it didn't have it. And the other one expected an image and it didn't have it. So this is one simple way in which you can uh, have some kind of like validation slash um, self checks in your React application. And now if I put things back, I save again, and because all the requirements are met, the validation passes. With that being said, that is called prop types. You can have different types like numbers. You can pass functions. You can pass objects. You can make them optional. You can make them required. There is a whole, different options that you have for managing prop types. And in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is switch to the final version of the application and explain a couple of things. Again, all of these are step-by-step instructions in the repository that I mentioned. The final version of the code is basically the moment that we have the code that we have right now. Um, the React is the code library. React DOM is to render and target specifically the web application. Prop types for simple validation. Babel for transpiling code, and you need to specify the type Babel when you import your script. As for the script itself, the final version is very similar to what we have. One thing that I'm doing here is that the prop uh, that I received, this is another JavaScript syntax called object destructuring. So I'm just like destructuring the object right in the function call, and that simplifies a bit how these things are called. You can notice like it might not be evident, but handle click here is a function. So remember that I mentioned that in prop types, you can have different type of data. So strings, numbers, and functions, and even more than this, you can specify. In the case of the candidate list, we are using something called state. The difference between state and properties, both of them are used to store data in a component, but in the case of properties, you receive them from a parent component. In the case of a state, you manage the data yourself. And anytime that a property or a state is modified, the component gets updated. It is called re-rendered. So any changes in props or states are going to trigger that re-render. This React.useState, React.useEffect, this is like the, something at this point not new, but probably 1 or 2 years, I think already, of a new syntax of how to work with React applications. Basically, what we're doing in this example is consuming a fake endpoint to load the data dynamically, because remember that in the point of the example here, I was still hard coding the results. So in this final example is just like making the whole process dynamic, faking a fetch operation, load the data, order them by the number of posts, and handling the click actions. And again, this is all um, literally JavaScript. It might seem a little bit weird. JavaScript, and in particular React, has a preference of using what it's called functional programming. So you will going to see filters, maps, and other reduced functions from time to time. But for the most part, it's core JavaScript, and that's one nice thing. The more that you work with React, the more JavaScript features that you learn. And if you ever need to switch to a Vue project or a Angular project or a plain JS project, you're just going to have a better understanding of the language itself. So it's kind of reusable. You can see that I have, this is where I fake the API call. I get some data from that API call, and I start, instead of like before, I had like one for each of the elements that I wanted to render. This time I have just like one code that is part of a map. Uh, and like that means like any piece of data that was returned is going to be rendered as a candidate. And the rating app is basically just like again the shell. And this is my fake API call when I can add more data. If I keep adding elements in this array, they are going to be rendered to the page ultimately. So with that, I'm going to briefly change to the presentation and then we open it up for questions. I would say that the live demo for the most part went well, just a couple of hiccups, but nothing major. That's great. So other reasons why we might want to use React, it's vibrant community. We are used to having a big Drupal community. I would say that React might be even bigger. It's it's very popular among big companies that have big needs, which pay big money and jobs abound. So if you are looking to new career opportunities, this is definitely something that might be a good investment. Um, there are integrations with a lot of libraries. Like for example, if you want to integrate Bootstrap or Foundation into your React application, chances are very high that you can find those integrations already there. Material UI, for example, if you want to use Google's take on how to build user interfaces, that is also available. And in these links, you can follow along for further resources. What about something else? Accessibility. That is something that when we work with Drupal, we kind of give for granted. Like Drupal has a strong stance on accessibility out of the box, even if you can do the stuff with extra module. There are a lot of features built in the core framework, but when you like if you decide to fully decouple your Drupal site and just use a React application, there are a lot of things that you lose, like those accessibility features, some SEO features, and so on. So what about that? How do you get them back? If you want accessibility, there is a library called Rich UI that has a lot of components that are accessible and you can use like right off out of the box. For SEO, there is one called React Helmet, and the reason for this is because this was developed by the NFL, and they use helmets, and that's why they call their library for SEO. If you want to create websites, you can use Gatsby. If you want to create enterprise application, you can use Next.js. If you want to have a high performance application, well, React itself is very performant. There are optimizations that you can do, but for the most part, the core library is very performant. And as I said, like there are big properties from big applications that serves billions of users, and it just works. How much JavaScript do you need to know, like ES6, the new syntax? Um, I would say that what you know already, it's a good place to start. Like I come from a Drupal background, and some of the things that I know about JavaScript, I actually learned by studying React itself. So things like the structuring arrays and objects, using the spread operator, using string literals, map filters, reducers, object mutation, using these arrow functions, CS modules. This might sound like big words, but like you can go to that URL and after reading that one article, you're going to have a better sense of all of this. And as I said before, the better that you get at React, the better that you become with JavaScript, and you can take this to your next project, even if it is not using the library. Some other concepts, we talk a little bit about prop types, which is a little about validation of components. Context, we didn't go too deep into this, but normally you can have a high layer hierarchy, like many levels of components. And sometimes you want to use something at the top level, excuse me, something like, let's say 5 levels down in the hierarchy that is available at the top level. So normally you will have to, what is called prop drilling, pass that properties throughout all the levels. And if you don't want to do that, there is this context API that allows you to use anything that is available inside a context, no matter how deep in the hierarchy you are, without having to pass manually the properties one level to the next, to the next, to the next. Um, Something that is not as common nowadays because of new ways of working with React is lifecycle methods. They still exist under the hood, but starting with the use of React hooks, this is not something that you are going to encounter yourself as often as before when we were using class-based components. But still, if you have a project that uses this syntax, in that URL, you can find some documentation. Hooks, what I said, is like the new kid in the town, new way of working with React. And I would say that it has revolutionized how React applications are written. And with that, I like teaching, I like training, and I am preparing a course that goes beyond what we showed today. It's understanddrupal.com/reactjs. In that course, we also talk about routing. We also talk about forms. We also talk about validation. So if you would like to learn more, there is a sign-up form to get news about the course. And with that, thank you very much. I would appreciate any feedback. And if there are questions, I am more than happy to respond them at the moment right now.
Thanks, Mauricio. I had a question, and I'm afraid I was terribly late, so I apologize to everyone if this was already covered. But if, let's say, we want to use React in some small way on our Drupal 8 site or Drupal 9 site, and let's say we wanted to make a custom module, perhaps that had a block that had some kind of React widget on it. What kind of general approach or tools might one use? Where would I start to learn how to do something like that?
Okay, let me show you something quick here. So the way that this would work is try to think what is the requirement for React to be available on a page. For one, you need the import statements for the React application itself. So in Drupal, depending on Drupal 7 or if it's Drupal 8 or 9, you call Drupal.js, or you create a library, and in that library, you specify the import for the library itself. So one step is creating um, the way to load React library into the page. Again, that is going to depend on the version of Drupal that you're using. The second step is to create the mounting point. The mounting point, it's as simple as a div with an ID, for example. So what you can do is either hard code this in a template or create a custom block, and in that custom block, the render method, the build method, is going to return this hard coded part. And the third element that you need is the React application itself. And for that you can create the application completely in a separate repository, or you can create it as part of your main Drupal repository, just like an extra folder, something like React or JavaScript. And what you do is that after creating the application, normally you go through the bundle process that I mentioned before. That is going to give you one JavaScript file that is that also needs to be loaded into the app. Um, so like it's like just like trying to comply with what React expects. Define a library that loads the React and the React DOM. Somehow, no matter if it is a custom block or hard coded in a template, define the mounting point, and then the end result of bundling your application, that is going to give you a JS file that you also need to load into the page. And you might be already familiar with a custom JavaScript file for in a module. It's exactly the same idea. You just have one extra JavaScript file that you want to load, and using, let's say, Drupal 8 or 9, you can use the libraries API to say, oh, I want to load this in every page, or I only want to load this in the search section of my website, or I only want to load this when this block is rendered on the page. In that case, you can define the dependency on the library as part of the build of the block itself. So there is literally nothing special or nothing unique that you need to do. It's about adding the JavaScript files and the mounting point. How you do that, by regular Drupal means, like Drupal.js for Drupal 7, Drupal libraries in Drupal 9 and 8, and the mounting point can be hard coded in a template, or just like as part of a blog build process.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was really, really helpful.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions?
I have a question, Mauricio. It doesn't necessarily have to do with this presentation, but you shared that you were putting together a training curriculum for this. Is that something you're going to offer at Drupal camps and Word camps like you have with your other trainings, like the migration trainings and that sort of thing?
Yes, actually, this was developed originally for Design for Drupal 2019, if I remember correctly. So unfortunately, that was not recorded, so only the person who attended got to see it. But yes, I am open to presenting these trainings at Drupal camps, and if they get recorded, I'm happy to, to show that as well, to do that as well.
Great. I just organize a lot of camp trainings, and you just teach in such a nice way that I think that might be something to offer at Bad Camp or something like that. So I really thank you.
I think this was also presented at Nice Camp, well, New York Camp last year. So that might be recorded actually because it was online. I don't remember, to be honest. But yeah, I'm more than happy to present this at online events as well.
Sure. Does anybody have any questions?
Sorry, I would ask a quick question. Since you worked with Drupal in the past, if we're looking at, certain areas within our Drupal site that we can see React, being something that we should be using, what are some areas of common Drupal websites that you would think to target maybe for using React in? I know somebody mentioned like custom blocks. Are there any other areas you think that are worth looking at to make it React based?
There are two primary examples that I have seen implemented many times. One of them is like the one that I shared, that is like a checkout experience. Maybe you are using a third-party API for checking out your website, and you just create a React application for that. So that's one thing that I have seen often. The other one that is very, very common is using search. So in Drupal, we have a lot of powerful search modules that have integrations with third-party APIs and so on. But sometimes like the user interfaces might be kind of rigid, if you will. You might want to have a better, more responsive approach. And normally, I have seen examples with a React application that connects, for example, to either a Solar or Elasticsearch backend, and just like API to API, like ultimately, as I said before, you have a shell, like your Drupal theme is going to render a shell, but for this specific page, you put a mounting point that is going to be used like in the main content region, and that is going to be loaded by React. And that React then just like communicates with either Solar directly or through some intermediate step using Drupal. Those are probably the biggest use cases, but like think of this as React is very useful for interactive, responsive JavaScript applications. So maybe you have like uh, Drupal, and I think that is still working. Let me check. Drupal.com.
Yeah, it pulls it from the community events page.
Yeah, so you can create something like this, where you have a map and it is being updated automatically via a React application. You can build like I think it's another project called Country Kanban. I am pretty sure that this is also a React application that very, very likely has a Drupal backend because it's built by a high-profile community member, Matt Gleeman. So, you can go as far as replacing the whole application, the whole site with React, or you can go just like building specific features. This is like a cardboard implementation. So it depends on your specific need, but this is what I usually see, like checkout processes, search interfaces, maps, or just like something that is very UI heavy.
Very cool. Thank you, Mauricio.
You're welcome. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you again for having me. And remember, the repository is there. It is open source. And you can literally follow the instructions in the comments to know what to do. Sometimes I give you partial answers. And the next step in the repository is the solution from the previous one. So hopefully that's useful. This is meant to be like a self-paced training as well, in addition to like a live session like this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mauricio.
Thank you.